Darren, you're an awesome resource on mosses. And moss is the bane of many gardeners. But other gardeners would love to have a moss garden. What's the true definition of a moss garden?
Well, to my knowledge, there is no actual official definition of a moss garden. I suppose you could compare it to rose gardens that are there to display rose species and varieties. Other plants can be found in a rose garden, but they don't detract from the impact of the roses. And it's like that with a moss garden too. In a moss garden, mosses are the stars of the show. Some other plants can be found in and around moss gardens, but the stars of the show are the mosses. And those other plants there are there to complement mosses and not detract from them. In Bloedel Reserve's moss garden, we follow a couple principles in the design and maintenance of the moss garden. First, we create a lot of room for moss to grow, keeping areas clear, provide different surfaces like not just the ground, but also rocks and rotting logs, old stumps, tree flares, tree trunks. The more surface you can provide, the greater diversity of moss species you can encourage to grow in your moss garden. And second, other non-mosses, other plants, are a great addition to any moss garden, but they shouldn't steal the thunder, so to speak, of the mosses. Flowers are certainly okay to have in a moss garden, but they shouldn't grab anyone's attention. They should be either more muted colors or in smaller quantities, and that's what we aim for when we put flowers within the moss garden. Ultimately, our goal at Bloedel Reserve's moss garden is to provide visitors with a sense of a primeval or fairy tale nature in their experience as they go through the moss garden and enjoy the various shades of greens of the mosses. The history of the Bloedel Moss Garden began in 1982, and after the area was cleared, they planted 275,000 starts of...
275,000?
Yep, starts of Irish moss, which wasn't a real moss, but it looks very moss-like. And the intent was that the native mosses would eventually take over and replace the Irish moss, which they did after about 5 years.
Whoa. What are the common mosses that visitors might see when they come to visit Bloedel?
So, as far as we're aware of, we have about 50 species of mosses and liverworts.
50 species?
Yep, here in the moss garden that we know of. But most of the mosses that you'll encounter belong to maybe a couple handfuls, maybe 10 species.
Which you're going to tell us about, right?
Yeah, perhaps the most common one is Menzies tree moss. In fact,
my favorite.
We're standing on some right now.
I know, we're on a forest, aren't we?
Yep. It's called a tree moss because it superficially resembles a tree. If you pluck a stem out, it'll have a bare trunk, so to speak, and then a tuft of green branches at the top. And then that's where it gets its tree.
Yeah.
In the sunnier areas of the moss garden.
Wait, there are sunny areas in the moss garden?
Not many, but they're there.
Okay.
It's relatively sunnier.
Okay.
You'll find bent leaf moss. And it's tends to be more of a golden green colored moss. How I can tell I'm looking at bent leaf moss is if you look at it from top down, the stem tips look like little stars. On the ground in the shadier areas of the garden, like this dark green patch even right down there, you'll find Selwyn's smoothcap. It's a darker green moss with upright stems, and it prefers to grow on soils. You won't find it on logs and rocks usually.
Really?
Yep.
Huh.
A lot of mosses are particular about where they grow. Our largest moss that you'll find in the moss garden, it's bottlebrush moss. It's that name from its resemblance to bottle brushes.
Yeah, like you clean your brushes or a pop bottle or something.
Central stem and a lot of spirals around it.
Oh my gosh.
And the stems can get quite large eventually, this tall, and it'll form mounds.
That tall?
Yeah, it doesn't quite look like it. They mat a little bit when you pluck one out.
Oh my goodness.
You almost don't know that it's a moss.
What are the basics of taking care of a moss garden? If I really wanted one, what would the basics be?
It's pretty simple, really. Here in the moss garden, I pull weeds, remove unwanted plants.
Wait. You have to pull weeds in a moss garden?
Very carefully.
Okay.
It's, unwanted plants. Sometimes some of the native plants tend to overpopulate.
But you could put them somewhere else.
Yes, they don't have to go home, but they can't stay here.
Okay.
Our goal really is to keep moss growing surfaces clear so that moss can receive optimal light and space.
Becomes the true star.
Yes.
How do you grow moss?
Well, moss is surprisingly easy to grow, or not surprising if you ever had to deal with it on your roof or sidewalk.
Right, right.
Really, the main ingredient is patience. It just takes time to get moss established.
You have to be patient?
Yep, you do.
Oh dear.
At the Blodell Reserve, we mostly take one of two different methods. For small mossy spots that were damaged and need repair, we may transplant larger chunks of moss from out of sight areas of the grounds.
So you can actually take it and put it where you want it?
Yes, most mosses will transplant okay like that.
And so you'd have to water mosses too?
We do
sometimes?
Yeah, especially when we're trying to get them established.
Yeah.
Mosses are surprisingly drought tolerant though. I can go on vacation 2 weeks and I don't have to get someone to water for me.
How cool is that?
Yep.
I want that kind of garden. Yeah.
Yeah, if we keep the area where we want moss free of weeds and debris, moss will eventually just fill in and grow on its own. Mother Nature will do the work for you.
Cool.
Yeah, the moss garden has such a large amount of moss here that it's full of spores.
So like, could we be breathing moss spores?
You could potentially be breathing moss spores, but they won't hurt you.
Yay, I like that.
But even in people's home gardens around the Puget Sound, you can get moss to grow the same way.
Yeah.
Because moss spores are really everywhere, and anyone can grow moss if they can just put in the labor to keep the space clear.
Cool. I'm so glad you told our visitors how to grow moss. And for sure come to Blodell to see it.
Oh yeah, I love to talk with people.
Oh yes, I know. Thank you.
You're welcome.